Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Levinka, and I'm the event director at the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to be collaborating with our friends again at NYRB Classics for a discussion of Susan Taubes' modernist masterpiece, Divorcing, with Jess Bergman, David Rieff, and Ethan Taubes. While the pandemic has taken a toll across all of our lives, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become bright spots in our days. And I want to give a huge thanks to Jess and David and Ethan for joining us tonight. So to some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We'll try to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the program. There's also a chat button down here where I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book from our store. So very importantly, click and buy, which would be great. A caveat for tonight's event and for all virtual events, we're at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads. So please bear with any technical issues that could arise. We will try to solve them quickly. And finally, our event series will continue through the fall and into the winter. So head over to our website to find out what's coming up. One program that I want to point out, on November 12th, we're excited to continue our NYRB series and welcome artist Celia Paul live from the UK to discuss her new book, Self-Portrait, in conversation with Judith Thurman. We are taking registrations for that event now, and I will be posting a link to it in the chat. So now a little about our presenters, and we will get started. Jess is an editor at The Baffler and contributing writer at Jewish Currents. Her essays and criticism have also appeared in Lapham's Quarterly, The New Republic, and The Cut, among other outlets. David is the author of 10 books, including The Exile, Cuba in the Heart of Miami, Slaughterhouse, Bosnia and the Failure of the West, A Bed for the Night, Humanitarianism in Crisis, Swimming in a Sea of Death, A Son's Memoir, and most recently, In Praise of Forgetting, Historical Memory and Its Ironies. He lives in New York City. And Ethan worked for the Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Asylum and Refugee Corps of the United States government for over 20 years. Before that, he worked for various advocacy organizations representing asylum seekers in the US. He also served as the program director for the International League for Human Rights, where he coordinated projects on freedom of religion, the rights of the child, and refugee issues. He currently works part-time as a consultant representing asylum seekers. And in a previous incarnation, he attended the Yale School of Drama and enjoyed a 12-year career in theater. Jess, David, Ethan, the stage is yours.
Hi, thanks guys for being here with me tonight. Before we get started, I just wanted to read a quick introduction of the novel, and then I think Ethan is going to say a little bit about it too, and then we'll have a reading. Before we know almost anything about Sophie Blind, the protagonist of Susan Taubes' 1969 novel Divorcing, we learn that she is dead. At least that's what Sophie claims in the novel's opening pages. It's quite certain I am dead. It's in the newspaper. But nothing is quite certain in Divorcing, not Sophie's mortality, nor even what kind of novel this is. Though it does depict the dissolution of Sophie's marriage to an overbearing academic named Ezra, Divorcing's domestic concerns quickly slip into the psychological, philosophical, and world historical. Its form is equally unpredictable. More conventional narratives are spliced with letters, passages that read almost like shorthand notes, modernist visions, references to a meta-novel, and even a play. Across these modes, details about Sophie Blind, many consonant with Susan Taubes' real life, gradually accrue. Not just about her protracted, bitter divorce, but also her flight from Nazism in Hungary, her psychoanalyst father, her parents' loveless marriage and the corrosive effect it had on her childhood, and her struggle to feel whole or at home in the world. Though it resists easy categorization, it is perhaps most profoundly a novel of exile, a label capacious enough to include the separation of husbands and wives, but also children from their parents, families from their homeland, people from God, and a woman from herself. In the years after Divorcing was originally published, dreamlike novels would begin to exert an influence on literary culture that continues to this day. But Susan Taubes' ambitious experiment was not celebrated in its own time. Its most visible detractor was the critic Hugh Kenner, whose New York Times pan of Divorcing began with a barbed comparison to Taubes' friend Susan Sontag and ended with a dismissal of the with it cat's cradling of lady novelists. This reception partly accounts for the novel's obscurity, as more profoundly does Taubes' death by suicide shortly after its publication. But today, Divorcing's stature stands to change. The reissue of this inventive novel by New York Review Books means that it has been given another chance at life. It also means that readers have been given the chance to acquaint themselves with a singular intelligence, one that wrapped the trauma and destabilization of the post-war world, not only in fiction, but in academic writing, prolific personal correspondence, and beyond. So Ethan, I want to hand it over to you at this point.
Well, thanks so much. First, thank you all for being here today and participating. I want to thank the New York Review of Books for agreeing to republish and kind of resurrect this novel to give it a second life after it was consigned to oblivion. I want to thank the Brooklyn Community Bookstore for hosting this event. You can see that I've been to a lot of trainings, so I'm doing my kind of government thank you to everyone, including Jess, Jess Bergman, who is going to moderate, and of course my childhood and lifelong friend, David Rieff, who I'm so happy has agreed to be part of this discussion, and who actually wrote a really extraordinary preface to the book that I encourage everyone to look at. And also Jess Bergman wrote a review in Jewish Currents that I think is equally valuable to illuminating this book. I just wanted to say, before I read some passages from the book, I wanted to say a few things just to kind of frame the discussion. I hesitate to call this a novel in the conventional sense. It's not a chronological account. It has no tightly linear narrative. If those are your expectations, you'll be disappointed. It is experimental, as Jess said, in structure. It's very kaleidoscopic. It takes different approaches to narrative truth. It is a roman à clé, as the French would call it, insofar as many of the details closely align, sometimes with excruciating fidelity, to events in her life, and the characters depicted bear a striking resemblance to the actual people in her life, and I bear witness to that since I was actually present in some of those scenes. So I have firsthand evidence. The book employs various genres and voices, as Jess pointed out, including theatrical scenes and episodes. It also has dream and hallucination moments, and there's also a lot of flashbacks, and there are passages where you have the traditional omniscient narrator kind of guiding, like the 19th century realist novel, guiding the reader in a certain direction. And then finally, you have a voice of someone who is utterly bewildered witness. Interwoven in all of this kind of dense, often lyrical narrative strategy are philosophical meditations that are kind of unusual in a novel. And that's why I say it's a kind of a eclectic creation. And the thing is that there are meditations on time, on being, on spiritual search for God, in a post-Holocaust, post-Hiroshima world reeling and fractured after those catastrophes. There's a basic leitmotif, and again, Jess talked about this, running like a thread of Ariadne through all of these various kaleidoscopic psychic landscapes, which involve anguish, the inheritance of loss, a divided self. Divorcing, as Jess pointed out, is much more than a chronicle of a marriage gone bad. It's about being divorced and uprooted from one's original homeland, in her case, Hungary and Budapest, her cultural heritage, being uprooted and exiled from her communal heritage of being a European Jew. It's being divorced from the many family members who perished in that catastrophe. It's being divorced from one's own husband and from the children, the father of your children. But most of all, it's being divorced and estranged and alienated from what one is searching for, which is always the true and the authentic self. And then finally, it's that irrevocable hurtling towards one's own final divorce from this life. I just want to say a remark before I start the reading. I'm going to read passages from basically just one touching on the marriage, and then the others mostly flashbacks about her arrival in the United States and her departure from Budapest. The one about my father, I just would like to preface by saying that I once asked my mother before she killed herself why she had ever married my father, because I couldn't quite understand how they ever actually gotten along for 5 minutes. And she said to me, you have to understand, I was like 15, she said, you have to understand that after the Second World War and after all of those things had happened, we were in a state of shock and our judgments were clouded. And you have to know that your father was extremely charismatic, gifted, brilliant, intelligent. And I was tempted, I was seduced. And so it made me think of Oscar Wilde's line that I can resist anything but temptation. Okay, without further ado, let me read a few passages of this book, and then we can get on to the discussion. How did Ezra do it? She wonders dimly as she walks toward the kitchen, still half asleep. It's past 4. She will have a cup of tea. How did Ezra get in? By what fraud, cunning, or magic? When her door was locked, she always said no to all men, to silence. Her silence stated it clearly. Her look, her walk, the way she dressed and spoke. She was waiting for someone else, or perhaps for no man. She meant it when she told Ezra that she could not marry him because she was about to resolve something. She was not yet resolved. Ezra understood. It was his right to try to persuade her otherwise, to dissuade her from walking this path alone, wherever it led. She said she did not know, in her confessed state of ignorance, where her paths would lead. But Ezra was sure. She remembers only that he kept translating both her words and silences into another language, dazzling, polyglot, the foreign phrases from the Greek, German, Latin, Hebrew, French, verses from the Old Testament. She was trying to make out his features in the dark, the face changing like reflections in water, the hand now in her hair, now fingers groping between blouse and skirt and slip, then lightly up her thigh, the voice, breath weaving, brushing over her cheek, ears, throat, the fingers, cat-like, paddling through her bush, and there, before she knew, it in her palm came down over her hand, and she said, I want the real thing. It is at a calamitous moment that the past opens into view. A block of high apartment buildings raised in 15 years of marriage had been bombed away, revealing a long-forgotten landscape which lay hidden behind the walls. The clearing of the wreckage must wait. As for the price or damage to body, soul, and mind of 15 years of her life blanked out, or is it more? The sensation of forgetting comes back first, how one walked through years sealed in oblivion. It was a substance with its own weight and density, without color, texture, or taste, like some abstract Newtonian matter, the unremembered past. The first crossing by boat to America, putting an ocean full of mines and roving submarines between her and her childhood in Budapest. A sea voyage, a world war, another country, another language, distances which cannot be measured in miles or years, may have helped to cancel the first decade. Growing up in America during the war, the 10 years she lived as a child in Budapest broke off. As for the years in America from 1939 to 1947, they were disowned when she married Ezra. From the year she came to America For the next 8 years in Pittsburgh, then Garfield and Bryn Mawr College, till the year she married, she tried in vain to grasp the meaninglessness of every room and street corner, her inability to experience the rooms and streets as a moment in her life. In America, the sky was not sky. The grass was not grass. Sophie Landsman was not Sophie Landsman. But America was America. A child of 10 getting on a boat with her father and her uncle's family in 1939 was immune to the sorrow of leaving everything behind and fears about the years ahead of them in a new country. The grown-ups had decided to make the step that would change their lives because they feared Hitler would occupy Hungary. They left to escape the terrible fate Jews would suffer. It was of this that they spoke and of the hardships awaiting them in America. In the train from Budapest, before crossing the Austrian border, the Hungarian passport official had said to her aunt in beautiful country dialect, "Good woman, why are you taking these 3 beautiful children out of the country?" "Because they're Jewish children," Aunt Olga said, "and if I don't take them out of the country, the Nazis will kill them." "We're all Hungarian," the passport official said with feeling. "Jewish or Christian Hungarians, it's the same thing. We Hungarians will not let the Germans harm the children on our soil." "They are Jewish children," Aunt Olga repeated, and the passport official protested again that they were Hungarian children. She sat, her eyes nailed to the floor in mortified rage. It was over. It would have nothing to do with her in her new life. She stopped being Hungarian when she got on the train. From the day they boarded the SS Aquitania, she wrote only in English, and even though she had to look up most of the words in the Hungarian English dictionary. There had been the excitement of a week's boat trip. One day in a big New York hotel where the children raced each other up and down 30 floors on the stairways and the elevators. Another day's journey to Pittsburgh, emptying the great bags of sandwiches, potato chips, all variety of candies and soda pops their American uncle gave them. Suddenly, it seemed they got out of a car on a littered sidewalk and quickly, with only a glimpse of people sitting on the stoop, through a narrow doorway and up 4 flights of stairs. Then Uncle Dave said, "This is home." And they walked into a 1-room furnished apartment, each of them overcome by the sudden shock of loss, which had to be hidden. Every night through the first long summer, she listened to the grown-ups, low, anguished voices that went to sleep, believing they would go back. Only after the war broke out in September did everyone fully grasp the voyage to America was final. They could never return to Hungary. When Hungary joined the Nazi powers, it ceased to be their country. From that time on, Sophie wasn't sure that her Hungarian past had anything to do with her at all. She stopped thinking of Budapest. The person she had been there ended there. Chance memories of a particular place or moment blurred instantly into shame and confusion. Just want to say that this is a flashback to Budapest with her mother just before she left for America. Whenever her mother burst into tears, Sophie lapsed into angry silence, thinking, in America, I won't see you cry. I won't miss you. I'll never feel sad. She was going to America, where everything was white and very modern. In America, she would speak and write and think in English and forget Hungarian. But sometimes, after seeing her mother, it was she who cried, waiting at the trolley stop in the early evening. Suddenly, every portal tree, shop window, chance passerby seemed unspeakably beautiful and happy. And to think that all this was made meaningless for her because she was Jewish. Her walks through the city, the long trolley ride twice a day, crossing the chain bridge, the school day, her pride in her homework made questionable when they began talking about leaving, then made totally meaningless when it was certain that she was going. And finally, this is a flashback to her time in New York as a grown woman. It was a strange venture for Sophie Blind to write about what it was like to be a child in Budapest. The person who would be writing it wasn't there, not as she was now. She was writing in English in a New York City apartment. The child was in another country, in another language. She who was writing had not been there, couldn't be there then, but she could go back. Sophie Blind, now in New York, could go back. The child cannot, never having left. There was always that part which remains, continues, captive in its moment, and another that escapes. Someone else has somehow entered into the coming moment, a shadowy figure hurrying along a train platform with a suitcase, clutching her handbag and coach tickets. A woman in a traveling cape or a child holding on to her. They blur in the steam rising from the wheels, hastening along the train platform to the coach. One among the crowd of figures passing, unregistered, as a gentleman sitting by the window of one of the first-class coaches looks up from a page of a book to rest his eyes for a blank instant and returns to his reading. Thank you. That's it. Jess, it's all yours.
Well, one of the questions that I wanted to ask actually is about something that comes up twice, at least twice in the passages that you just read, which to me is, I think, one of the most affecting parts of this novel is the fact that Sophie struggles so much to make meaning from her life. Like the words meaninglessness, pointlessness, irrelevance, they come up again and again, whether she's talking about rooms and street corners or whether she's talking about her father telling her about his own childhood. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Sophie's disaffection and, you know, what both of you see as the origins of that disaffection and how does it go on to, you know, sort of shape the rest of her life.
David?
Not me. Yes. Well, I think the book is Ethan said quite correctly, I think, that it's a kaleidoscope, and it's a kaleidoscope in many senses. It's a geographical kaleidoscope and it's a temporal kaleidoscope, but it's also, you know, a kaleidoscope, if you will, of emotions or attempts to, in my view, at least, how to put it. It's a book about trying to find a reason to want to stay in the world, and not in a deep way finding it. I mean, yeah, you as you said, you alluded to Hugh Kenner's Unspeakable Review, but obviously that, you know, may or may not biographically, and this is for Ethan to say, not for me. I mean, I only know this through what my own mother told me, and I don't know how reliable it was her view. It doesn't make it true. But, you know, everything that Susan Taubes wrote was a questioning of wanting to be there. Had she been a different personality, she might have been Beckett, who had every bit as much disdain for existence or alienation from it, or all these words are insufficient, but in one sense or another. as someone said of Beckett, his quarrel was with the book of Genesis. And, there is a sense in which Divorcing is a book about, why do I want to go on with this? Why did I get in this mess in the first place? That's of course, the marriage. And then why in effect am I staying here? And it's a kind of you could view it as a set of rehearsals for death, because obviously it's at different points. People listening to us won't know this because most, I think, if not all, won't have read it. But there are various versions of Sophie Blind's death that unfold in the novel. And so, what I admire its despair in exactly the way I admire Beckett. I admire its unflinching despair. But of course, Beckett was in a certain sense a thug, and Susan Taubes was in a certain sense a victim. And that is, in some way, I'd probably argue, what distinguishes them. I mean, partly, of course, it's an issue of gender and of the times. I mean, Kenner's review, among other things, is quite extraordinary to read today, when it talks about lady novelists and how appalling and, in principle, ridiculous they are. I mean, you actually can't quite. I mean, I dug up the review, which I probably hadn't read in 45 years, and it was really quite daunting. But I mean, there are two things. There's the despair, and then there is this very ambitious book that's kind of about everything, about intellectual life, a lot about the what Marx called the Jewish question, et cetera, about Europe and America. That part doesn't obviously resonate as much, certainly with younger people today, because it's obviously a very different country than the one Susan Taubes landed in. But I say at the end of my little preface, this is a book that bleeds, and there aren't that many books that do that. And I think that's its special curse and its special grace. And that probably gets as close to describing the book from my perspective as I'm going to this evening. So I should probably stop there.
The point that you made about, death obviously has it's a very death-haunted novel. But there is this sort of interesting push-pull. There are intimations of suicide. There's an obvious attraction to death. But at the same time, you have, Sophie is reeling from the specter of the mass death of the Holocaust and of Hiroshima. So yeah, I wondered if you two wanted to talk, a little bit about that. Like, I think that there's a strong attraction and repulsion to death in the novel. It really feels like a tussle.
Well, let me just bring in another dimension to both what David said and your question, which is that my mother was someone who actually, from my perspective at least, was very engaged with life. This was a despair that was very carefully veiled. It was like a cover-up. I just have to kind of share that her suicide for me was a complete surprise, not for many other people who knew her well. But I'm just saying that as far as certain, this was not something that she wore on her sleeve. This is not something that she publicized. She fought very, very hard against what I think a lot of people experience today as depression, serious depression, and which was never really treated. And the problem of one of the reasons why it was not treated is that in those days, in the 50s, the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, these, her father was an Orthodox Freudian, which made her allergic to therapy in itself because of his kind of obsessive, closed universe of how everything has to be clarified, demystified, and revealed, which was anathema to her whole spiritual search for meaning. She was also an extremely political person, which is also not quite obvious from this novel, but if there are letters that are published from her youth that I think form a kind of a remarkable bookend to this novel, because the letters were written, show an extremely precocious intelligence at 20, 21, 22, basically on a search for meaning through European continental philosophy and German, romanticism, or from Heidegger to just a kind of an amazing breadth of just intellectual curiosity, challenging my father, questioning the state of Israel's creation, and the issue of political theology and group identity, and desperately looking for some way to find some kind of spiritual meaning and that beloved community that we're all seeking in some way. And the early letters just show her just a kind of almost an ecstatic or rapture level of engagement in this relationship with my father that she so much hoped would be the true marriage, the kind of the kind of sacred, I guess in the Greek parlance, it's the idea of that sacred marriage, because her parents' marriage was for her like a complete fraud, a fiasco, something which they themselves didn't have, any belief in. Basically, my grandmother was someone who was encouraged to have affairs by her husband who didn't love her. She had an apartment, actually, this is in the novel, but in the house itself where they lived, but just as a visitor. And then she would go back to her love affairs with people who were actually World War I veterans and friends of my grandfather, who he had encouraged to be her chaperones, because that made him feel kind of proud of her ability to seduce other men. So this was an extremely torturous and fraught relationship. And so my mother never really understood what an intact, loving family was about, and was never really parented. She barely saw her father, who was with patients most of the time. So this marriage to the character of Ezra Blind, for her, was the ultimate kind of like throw of the dice. The die was cast, and when this failed in spectacular fashion, she was kind of left in a very kind of nihilistic position of a world of total disenchantment. She really didn't have much to hold on to. They were friends, the spiritual extension, family, and there was, literature and art, but these are only redemptive and salvific to a certain extent for a person of her spiritual intensity. And I guess the last thing I'll say on this is that the Gnostic, which plays a very important role in all of this in modernity, which is this idea that the world after, if Auschwitz and Hiroshima left an indelible mark, it was the mark of the absent God, that there can be no justification for an Old Testament or even a New Testament God at this point. For a person who is not chained to some doctrinaire, confabulation, for a person who is making an intellectually honest attempt to live a meaningful existence by seeking to bond spiritually with others in a community. So I think that the disappointments, the disenchantments were crushing for a person of her sensibility. And David's absolutely right in his introduction when he says that what David Hume once said of Rousseau, which is that he was a man without his skin, walking around without his skin on, or without an exoskeleton to kind of protect him from the slings and arrows of the world. And I think my mother was equally vulnerable and didn't really have that kind of protective armor that a lot of us develop to survive on a daily basis. COVID, political meltdown, eschatological end times, and all those other pressures of everyday life that we seem to just kind of breeze through. Anyway, I don't know if that gives another kind of sheds light in any way, but I'm certainly happy to answer more personal questions or give anecdotes, anything that can help give perspective or a vantage point to the adventure of this novel.
Yeah, well, your point about spiritual seeking is really interesting to me, and I'm curious if you see it as, if you see your mother's turn to fiction, from the other modes of writing and thinking that she was doing before that, in the correspondence with your father, but then of course, in her academic work and in her, she taught and studied religious studies, and yeah, I'm curious if, was the novel, and I know she also wrote a novella that hasn't been published and a number of short stories. Like, do you think that this search for a genre or a mode of writing was sort of connected to the other kind of the search, the spiritual search and the search for the authentic self?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that like a lot of us, we're all looking for redemption somewhere from sort of meaning-making activities. And I think that writing, literature, the exploration of the self, the examined life was certainly one venue. The thing that's kind of interesting is that, she came from a family that was basically, even though her grandfather was a very eminent rabbi, Orthodox rabbi in Budapest, she herself, her father was an atheist, and as well as the seven other brothers of the family. Only the women remained Orthodox, and actually one was exterminated in Auschwitz because she married the chief rabbi of Sarajevo. But all the sons were completely secular and broke off. And so she had basically a secular education. But when she met my father, who was a rabbi, and whose father was the chief rabbi of Zurich and who came from an Orthodox background and a kosher, this was like a collision of two completely different worlds. And so I think that for her, this was already a leap of faith that they could somehow work this out. From the beginning, and then going to Israel. So it just was, I think it was a real challenge going through first trying to find your identity in a Jewish context, and then realizing, just feeling repelled by the different choices of community that there were, that you just felt very much like Kafka in the sense that she couldn't feel authentic as a Jew, among Jews, but she didn't feel comfortable. She understood that she didn't really belong anywhere outside of that community in a lot of ways. So literature, to answer your question, was kind of like a sanctuary, a last refuge for somebody who was that deeply estranged. And I'll just say this to the audience out there listening very patiently, I must say, is that one of the things that I think makes this novel relevant on a more topical level is this theme of kind of anguished exile. I mean, as a person who worked as a refugee and asylum officer for over 20 years, I am traveling throughout the world to different refugee camps. And David himself, I know from a different angle, as a as a reporter and journalist in dangerous places. Sometimes we might have even intersected without knowing. This theme of homelessness and of being uprooted and of being torn from your origins and your frame of reference, and of having to begin to rebuild a kind of lingua franca with a community that doesn't exist really, that you have to kind of find and patch together as best you can. This was a challenge for her more than others, in the sense that I think she just never really reconciled herself with that break and with being American. I think, unlike a lot of immigrants who come here, who can bridge that gap, who feel grateful to be here, to have a new home, to have a new beginning, even with all of the prejudices and the bigotry and the hazing, and the culture shock and the trauma and the depression from being persecuted. I think that my mother really just did not make that transition well, that she didn't want to leave. And she didn't want to lose that world. And that world was, and I think the fact that she didn't have a strong family support system, she didn't really have a community to help her out. And that this marriage, I think, just exacerbated all of those contradictions and was very, I think the sense of betrayal and the sense of defeat was overwhelming, because she had such high expectations to be able to overcome that past of lovelessness. And before we end, I should say that my sister, who couldn't be here today, actually asked me to read something that she wrote up, very much on these themes. So I'll just be quick about it. My sister is a psychiatrist, and so she looks at this from perhaps that angle, but she says, "Divorcing is an apt title for this courageous book. The novel dissects the dissolution of the protagonist's marriage as well as that of her parents. This is only one iteration of the word divorcing. Many other intonations of that word resonate throughout the book: rupture, uprootedness, isolation, death, ultimate divorce are well-crafted themes presented prodigiously, varying styles, storytelling, stream of consciousness, inner dialogue, fragmentary dialogues, among others. The novel's first publisher chose the title Divorcing. The author's original choice was To America and Back in a Coffin. It suggests America as a geographical apogee, a failure to arrive and take root, and death as a state of being. All three are experiences at the novel's core. An imagined death jolts the protagonist, Sophie Blind, in the book's second paragraph. The sixth paragraph gives another nod to the title. Sophie Blind is used to unfamiliar rooms. She had been traveling all her life. Feeling that one is waking up in the wrong place, yearning for the right place, only to arrive once again in the wrong place, is a universal nightmare, but also one that haunts refugees in particular. Sophie Blind leaves her native Budapest as a young girl for America in '39. In divorcing, these short arrivals are Sisyphean. No location holds any certainty. All the protagonists can rely on is death. More ominously, one cannot count on love. The presence, hey, that's my dog, just so that you know. It's not me. The presence of death is in tandem with the absence of love. Whether written in a gallows humor style or with attention to the fringes of consciousness, Sophie Blind never feels truly loved, neither by her parents, her husband, or her lovers, and finds that she herself, perhaps, cannot love either. The novel is full of compelling stories, masterful explorations of the human mind, hidden yet revealed in the truth, with love so evasive, death feels like terra firma. And she ends by saying the novel's imaginative and remarkable grasp of alienation is less about geographical uprootedness and more about the inability to love. The major characters seem to be alienated one way or the other from love, and this vacuum of love is brought to life in many cogent, different ways in the novel.
Well, thank
There
you
it is.
for that, and thank you to your sister. That feels like a good moment to transition into some of the audience questions. So I'm just gonna go through them one at a time for the time that we have. This first one is for David, and the question is, what was it like, revisiting the novel after all this time to write the introduction?
Painful. Because everything that Ethan has said and that his sister Tanya, right, I think are very accurate accounts. I do think my little point about Hume and Rousseau, the story goes that Rousseau, who was in flight from one set of authorities or another in Switzerland or in France, went to take refuge at Hume's house in Edinburgh. And they were sitting by the fire, and suddenly Rousseau jumped up and he said, "But David Hume is not a bad man." And he'd obviously been working out some immense, thunderous debate, moral tragedy in his head. And Hume, who was the most phlegmatic of people, I mean, that was his genius, that he was a grown-up, but he was dispassionate in a way very few people, certainly very few philosophers have been. He said this thing that Ethan quoted, that Rousseau is like a man walking around without his skin on. And, she really minded, because her standards, in my view, Susan Taubes, I mean, were higher than the moon. If you read the correspondence between Ethan's parents, which has been published in 2 volumes, in I think it's 50 to 52, is it, Ethan? Yeah. I mean, you see a level of passionate discourse, of taking things seriously doesn't even begin to describe the level of almost sacral relation to any subject that both these people had. She very much holds her own. In fact, you could actually argue that she in some ways outclasses Jacob Taubes. There's a biography of him coming out, which Ethan and Tanya obviously know a lot about, by this Jerry Muller, who's a scholar and has been writing this biography of Jacob Taubes for a very long time. And we'll see how he treats this. But when I wrote that preface, of course, I reread everything, and I read the letters, most of which I'd not read. I'd read them, and it is what's in the novel. It's a kind of it's intelligence as religious rite, as opera, as life or death on almost any topic. And that's a way of being in the world that's very difficult to sustain, because the world doesn't really care. And it's that degree. And I thought also what Ethan said earlier about, about disappointment. I think one of the reasons that it's, that she had such high expectations in some way, morally, intellectually. Even reading the book, reading these letters feels like too much, leaving aside all the biographical detail. You say to yourself reading them, but nobody could sustain that, no matter what happened to them. It's impossible. Even then, it's yes, of course, people read more, and a certain kind of erudition mattered more, perhaps, in the day. But that's not what it's really about. It's about ideas and morals being life and death affairs. And I'm not sure, we believe politics is a life and death affair, but I'm not sure we believe those things that Susan Taubes and indeed Jacob Taubes were wrestling with. Because Ethan's absolutely right about the centrality of Gnosticism for that generation, or anyway, the Gnostic perspective. I mean, it's encapsulated. I'm actually writing another preface, in for a penny, in for a pound, with New York Review of Books, of a Serbian novel, which is most interesting. And it led me back to a famous story about the Marxist philosopher Adorno, who, when he went back to Germany, he was in exile in the US, as you two certainly know, and as I'm sure many of the people listening know, went back to Germany in the late 40s, early 50s. And he said, rather unwisely, it's impossible to write poetry after Auschwitz. And of course, it was an image, it was a metaphor, it wasn't literal. I mean, Adorno knew all the great poets of the immediate post-war period. He knew Nelly Sachs, and he knew Kata Komar, and he knew Paul Celan, and so obviously he knew poetry, and very high level of poetry was being written, but he meant something more metaphysical. So about 10 years later, a student, some wise ass, said, well, Professor Adorno, you see that poetry is easy to write after Auschwitz. And Adorno smiled and said, well, you're probably right, but I'm not sure it's possible to live after Auschwitz. And that, I think, in some way describes what, in her own mind and heart, Susan Taubes was confronting.
I think that answer leads really well into the next question here, which is someone wants to know if either of you have a sense that Susan envisioned a future for her work or a literary place for the novel, because it feels so forward-thinking in its form and attitude.
Ethan could speak of the biographical things. Of course, she wanted it to work. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been so crushed by Kenner's vile critique. And she'd written other things. I think any writer who agrees to have a novel published wants, to have a say in literary, you're part of a continuum, whether your idea is that you're a willing follower of it, or you want, as they say in Silicon Valley, to disrupt it. It's my impression is that she certainly wanted that and had other projects. She was a philosopher and a writer, and those were her two vocations. Biographically, Ethan should talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with David. I mean, I think she was very invested in having a voice and trying to come to terms and grips. David, in his preface, cites Ciaron, which is saying that every book is a kind of like a last-ditch effort before suicide, postponement before suicide, and this time not so long. But I think that this was a desperate attempt on her part to stay in the world. And I think every act of writing of a person, I mean, as Kafka and Beckett made very clear, is an attempt to stick it out, to go on. And I think in her case with that, I don't think that review that was, as David said, was extremely vile and I think dismissive. It was kind of like the last, for her at that point, kind of nail in the coffin. When David was writing the preface, I pointed out to him, trying to help on the theme of kind of like being like preparing for your own funeral, or Mémoires d'outre-tombe, memories from beyond the grave, that I had in my possession her last journal from Budapest. She had made a last trip back. My sister and I hadn't seen her actually in months. because we had gone back to our various boarding schools. And our mother had been in Budapest and then come back. And 2 weeks before her death, she had written in her journal, I go in, I go out, time passes. In 2 weeks, I will have drowned myself. So what the precipitating factor of anyone's deciding to kill themselves is a very complex and usually multi-motivational phenomenon. You don't know. But all of those things were certainly conspired to make it more probable. I know that many of her friends felt devastated by what happened because it just seemed so awful and such a tragic loss of someone who was actually quite young, 41 years old at the time. So I think she did want to go on. And I think if she had had other relationships and the review of her book hadn't been killed at its inception and aborted, there's a very good chance that she might have remained. She might have found reason to stay in the world. I think that one can measure the degree of her anguish and despair by the fact that, and this is not a moral judgment, but that she felt so alienated and so anguished that she took her life when she still had 2 adolescent children to take care of in her custody. Anyway.
I think that this next one might have to be our last question, but it feels very connected to the conversation that you've already gotten on. So I wanted to ask it. Can you speak to the work that she left behind? Were there a few complete or near complete literary texts?
Is that addressed to me or?
I assume you would have the most knowledge of it, but whoever.
Well, right. I mean, there are. I mean, there is a novella that has not. Well, again, this is kind of like a kind of what we call in the law a parade of horribles, but it seems that it was actually in galleys in Paris in a publishing house about to come out when the publishing house burnt down. So it might have, like Divorcing, perhaps a second life. And I think the publisher of New York Review of Books is interested in, even though it was never published before, and perhaps taking a look at that. I think it's an extremely interesting, in some ways, a much more disciplined and or should I put it, tightly structured work. It's very kind of a little bit monomaniacal, but it's about a kind of schizophrenic personality of the self, of this Gnostic self looking down at the lived life of the person and saying, what the hell are you doing, basically? And it has a lot of comedic, so it's a different way of approaching that despair. And then there are a dozen short stories that I think are extremely interesting, that are what I call a kind of a strange amalgam of Kafka and Bolshevik Singer. There's a tremendous amount of kind of barely repressed violence. I think those are definitely worthwhile, should see the light of day if this launch goes well. But again, we are living in extraordinary times, and who knows what the future has in hold for any of us as far as what our reading futures will be and what will give us peace of mind and psychic balance.
Well, that is a great coda to the end of this. That was really fabulous. Ethan, David, Jess, thank you so much for your time in this and for just the extreme thoughtfulness of all of those answers and really walking us through the background of this book. And having set that aside now, we can see what the second life of divorcing will be. I can't wait to see, and it's in perfect hands with the NYRB Classics. Thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. Just before we leave, I am going to copy and paste the link to buy the book one more time in the chat, which will disappear after I click close. Please click that and check out the book. I can say from firsthand testimony that it is absolutely amazing, and a book that is truly a something that you will find and not realize that it has been missing from your life. Great holiday gift. So David, Ethan, Jess, thank you so much. We'll bid adieu to everyone, and everyone be safe, be healthy, and we'll do something again for the novella. We're gonna talk to NYRB. We're gonna make that happen.
Good idea. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you all.
Good night.
Be well. Be safe. Vote.
Vote.